Hello, students of historical theology at the King's University. My name is Ryan Litton. I'm your professor for this course, and today we're going to be talking about the Apostolic Period. Now, the Apostolic Period starts basically with Jesus' birth and ends with the death of John the Beloved, who is the last apostle to go on to be with the Lord, which was right around 100 AD. And so we've got about 100 years, basically just the first century is what we're dealing with here in the Apostolic Period. And I'm assuming that you've taken, some Bible survey classes or, hermeneutics or exegesis classes, that sort of thing. And so we're not going to deal with the New Testament itself in great detail. We just want to look at the development of theological ideas. And so to that end, I want you to just close your eyes and we're going to imagine something, okay? So what I want you to imagine is that you're a member of a religious community and that you attend religious services about once a week with family, friends, etc. And that you've been doing this basically your entire life. As a matter of fact, your parents have been doing this for their entire lives. Their parents did it for their entire lives, on and on and on, going back for hundreds of years. And, for some of us, this may not be terribly far from the truth. In my particular family, we've got some religious history going back for quite some time. So I want you to imagine that, okay? And then what I want you to imagine is that you go to a service one week, and someone that you are vaguely familiar with, maybe a cousin of a cousin kind of person, distant relative or, something like that. They get up during this religious service and they read from your holy text. They read a verse or two and they say, "This has been fulfilled in your hearing today." Now, this is a landmark moment for any kind of movement. For someone to stand up and say, right now is the fulfillment of what was said earlier. And then you can open your eyes now. This is essentially what happens with Jesus, right? Jesus goes into the synagogue, as was his custom, and it's his turn to read. If you study this story, Jesus probably would have had a turn to read maybe a couple of times in his life at the most. And it's fascinating. If you look at a picture of a Torah scroll, these things are gigantic. And it's not something that you would just open up and, kind of look for a page and say, oh, this is what I want to talk about. Right, I'm going to look at this. This is something that you would unroll and then you would read what's in front of you. And then you roll it and close it. And then the next week, when the next person reads, they unroll it and there's a new section, right? So if you look at this image, for instance, it's a Torah scroll, and you can see the sections on the scroll itself that you're going to read in these sections. You're not going to kind of move along and kind of do whatever you want, right? And notice the break there. Actually, this is not necessarily relevant to the lecture, but it's interesting. Notice the break there, the significant break there. That indicates the beginning of a new book. And so if you're curious, this is the beginning of Leviticus. You can know this because in Hebrew, the name of a book is the first word of the book, and Leviticus starts with Vayikra. So it's called Vayikra, which is just, and he called out. And that's what we have here. So I saw this Torah scroll in person, and it was kind of fun because the guys that were putting it on display didn't know any Hebrew, and so they were telling a story about how this is the beginning of a book, but they didn't know which book it was. So I got to tell them, that says Vayikra, and that means this is Leviticus. Anyway, so this is the sort of thing that you would unroll, you would read, and then you kind of shift to the next. Actually, you shift this way, right to left. So you shift to the next panel, and then the next week they would read that. And so it's fascinating that Jesus, in his opportunity to read from the Torah in the synagogue in his hometown, that when he gets to read, when he gets to open the scroll, what is there but a prophecy that deals with him, right? And so, you might imagine Jesus opening this and saying, "Hey, look, it's me," right? And so it's just fascinating, right? But if we think about this just from the perspective of historical theology, we have to recognize that the people that are listening to this have been going to this service their entire life, have been listening to these readings their entire lives, and it's got to come as somewhat of a shock to hear someone who maybe you're related to, maybe you're not related to, but sort of just from the same town, to hear this person say this passage in the Old Testament from Isaiah. Isaiah was talking about me. He was talking about this, in fact. And it's no wonder that right after this they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't this the carpenter's son?" And so you can kind of understand the tension that they have with regard to Jesus saying this, because it's sort of hard to swallow, right? And that's, from a historical theological perspective, for the purposes of this course, that's the tension that we're dealing with when we move from Old Testament to the Apostolic Age. Is what are we dealing with? What are we doing here? What is happening? How do we manage this? And so in the New Testament, one of the main things they're dealing with is, the Old Testament, but now what do we do with Jesus, right? How do we handle this? And they handle it by making these incredible references to the Old Testament to show the continuity of the Old Testament to Jesus. We see these when we see references to passages like Exodus 3 with the divine name. We see this when we reference Daniel 7 with the title Son of Man. And we see this even with thematic elements in, for instance, Matthew's Gospel. So, for instance, Exodus 3, if you're aware of the story, which you should be, is Moses in the burning bush, and Moses says to Yahweh, "Who should I say is sending me?" And Moses isn't just looking for a name there. From his perspective, this is a sort of a local deity, right? And in the ancient world, you sort of had local deities, and you had like these big cosmic deities. And local deities are worshipped in like holy places, like these little like set up kind of places. Cosmic deities are worshipped in temples. And so a local deity has like a local sphere of influence, maybe the god of this river, god of rivers perhaps. But a cosmic deity has like big influence, right? Local deities are a little bit more concerned with you individually, less power. Cosmic deities are a little less concerned with you as an individual, but more power. And so Moses, by all rights, thinks this is a local deity. This makes sense of him saying, "What's your name?" Because he isn't just saying, "What do I call you?" He wants to know, what is your sphere of authority? If you're the god of rivers, then when I go confront Pharaoh, I want to be near a river, right? And God's response to him is essentially, yes, right? What is your sphere of authority? Yes, right? And this is somewhat frustrating for Moses, as you might imagine. But what God says is, "I am that I am," or "I will be what I will be." And this is the divine name, essentially. God says, "I am," and we point to him and say, "He is," right? That's what Yahweh means. If we look at the word Yahweh, it is related etymologically with the word "I am" in Hebrew, right? So we have Yahweh and Ehyeh. These are related in Hebrew. And so Yahweh means he will be. And, if we move forward in the history of the Old Testament, the Old Testament gets translated into Greek, and then when it gets translated into Greek, this Ehya Asher Ehya gets translated into Ago Emi Ha'on. And this Ago Emi phrase in Exodus 3 in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this gets used by Jesus frequently. Most notably, probably, most famously, probably, in John chapter 8, when the Pharisees say, you're not even 50 years old. How can you say that you saw Abraham's day? And Jesus' response is, before Abraham was, Ago Emi, right? I am. And there's multiple I am statements in John. There's a lot of writing and preaching on that, on Jesus' I am statements in John. But that's not the only place that it happens. It happens elsewhere in the Gospels. One of my favorite examples is Matthew 14, when Jesus is walking on the water. If we look at Exodus 3, when God says, I am, and then he says, Yahweh, right? The Lord is my memorial name for all generations. Lord there in English is all caps. That's Yahweh, right? And Yahweh is the most common noun in the Old Testament. It occurs 6,300 times in the Old Testament. This word gets translated as Lord or Kyrios in the Greek Old Testament. And so in the Greek Old Testament, we have this sort of pairing of I am and Lord, right? And so when we look at Matthew 14, when Jesus walks on the water, he's walking to the disciples and he says, do not be afraid, it is I, right? And in Greek there, he says, Ago Emi. And to prove that this is a claim to divinity, claim to be the God of the Old Testament, Peter's response to him says, is that, Lord, if it's you, right? And so the interplay there is the disciples have exhausted their professional competency. They are accustomed to handling this boat on this water, and this storm is too much for them. And so they're obviously afraid of what's happening. And they see this person walking on the water and obviously think it's a ghost, because who else could walk on this water? They can't even survive in a boat. So how could someone survive walking on the water? So Jesus says to them, don't be afraid, I'm Yahweh. Right? He says, Ago Emi. And Peter's response to him is, Yahweh, if it's you, tell me to come on the water. And Jesus essentially says, I'm totally Yahweh. Come on, let's do this. And so then Peter walks on the water, and then he fails. But the point being there is that we have a claim not only to divinity. It's important that we recognize the New Testament authors aren't primarily concerned with telling us that Jesus is God. They're primarily concerned with telling us that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. Remember that continuity thing, right? That if we have the Old Testament now, what do we do with Jesus? See, it's not enough in the New Testament to say Jesus is God. We have to say Jesus is that God, right? We have to say he's the same one, the one from the Exodus, right? He's that one, right? And so through the use of Ago Emi, through the use of Kyrios, I am, and Lord, we see this continuity to the Old Testament, that Jesus is that God. But we also see this continuity in the use of the phrase Son of Man. The Son of Man is a reference to a passage in Daniel chapter 7, particularly verse 13 and 14. And Daniel chapter 7, we have this Ancient of Days, who is, obviously Yahweh. And we have this other figure who is separate from, separate is probably a strong word, distinct is probably a better way to put it. And so we have this other figure who is distinct from the Ancient of Days. And he goes up to the Ancient of Days and receives from him power, kingdom, and authority. Okay? That's important. He goes up to him on a cloud. In rabbinic literature, Yahweh is in several places referred to as the cloud rider, and that this is a divine prerogative. No one else gets to ride on the clouds but Yahweh. And so that this person is riding a cloud up to Yahweh is significant, right? That this person is somehow divine. And so when Jesus uses Son of Man, this is actually his favorite name for himself, same favorite title for himself, we might say. And he uses it to point to Daniel chapter 7, to say that I am that person. You know, in the latter part of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is talking to religious leaders, Jewish religious leaders, and he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, right? He's overtly stating to them that I am the one from Daniel chapter 7 who received a kingdom, power, and authority from the Ancient of Days. And you will see me on that cloud to verify my claims, right? This is an overt claim, not just to divinity, but to the divinity of the Israelites, right? The God of Israel. He is that God. But we also see this in Matthew's gospel. If we look at Matthew's gospel, Matthew tells us, you know, in the early parts, let's say Matthew 1 through 8, Jesus goes to Israel, or goes to Egypt, right? This happened so that it would be fulfilled as it was written, out of Egypt I've called my son. This is Matthew 2:15. Quoting Hosea 11:1, which is a fascinating quotation, since the Hosea 11:1 passage is talking about the Exodus, it's not talking about a future event. And so Jesus goes to Egypt. Jesus departs Egypt and goes through the water, his baptism. Directly following his baptism, he goes into the wilderness, and he's tempted in the wilderness. Directly following the wilderness, he goes up on a mountain and he teaches proper behavior. Here's how you ought to live, right? Now, if you look at the Pentateuch, Israel goes to Egypt. Israel leaves Egypt through the water, through the Red Sea. Egypt goes through the Red Sea into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they're not just tempted, but they fail. And then after the wilderness, Moses goes up on a mountain and teaches them proper behavior through the law, right? And so Matthew has this direct parallel, this thematic parallel. That's how he can quote Hosea, right? This is one of these troubling passages in the New Testament where people look at that and they say Matthew is quoting Hosea 11:1 out of context. Well, if you understand Matthew's perspective, he's not quoting it out of context. Matthew is saying Jesus succeeds where Israel fails. And so just as Israel had to have an exodus, Jesus has to have an exodus. And so Jesus' exodus happens so that it would be fulfilled as it was written, out of Egypt I've called my son. Israel has an exodus, Jesus has an exodus. And more to the point, where Israel fails, Jesus succeeds. It's fascinating if you look at the temptation of Christ in the desert in Matthew chapter 4. Look up his quotations. What does he quote? You know, Satan tempts him in the same way that Israel is tempted in the desert. And it's as though Jesus is saying, I will not fail in the way that they failed. And so he quotes Deuteronomy, where Deuteronomy is specifically referencing the failures in the desert, in the wilderness, right? And so Deuteronomy is saying you should not have behaved this way, looking back to the past. And Jesus is saying, I will not behave that way, looking back to the past, right? And so he's directly paralleling Israel's failure and saying, I will succeed where they failed, right? And so this is the thematic parallel within Matthew. And so we see just, you know, and there's plenty of other things we could explore, but just these three things, the use of I am and Lord, the use of Son of Man, and the thematic parallels in Matthew. They show us that the New Testament authors, that the covenant community in the Apostolic Period, is really trying to wrestle with this. We have the Old Testament, so what do we do with Jesus, right? And so they're struggling to show continuity, to say that this is what the Old Testament said, and it's consistent with what Jesus has done. We see this in Paul's letters, right? In Galatians, he says, the law was our tutor leading us to Christ. The purpose of the Old Testament was to point to Jesus, right? We see this Romans chapter 3, he says God publicly displayed him as an atoning sacrifice or a propitiatory sacrifice. Or, it sort of depends on what your translation says there. But the word there is hilasterion in Greek. And hilasterion is the word that gets used in the Old Testament for the mercy seat. And so Paul says God passed over those sins formerly committed and publicly displayed Christ as a mercy seat. And so what this is saying is that the mercy seat in the Old Testament didn't actually serve to forgive sins. The sacrificial system didn't actually serve to forgive sins. The mercy seat in the Old Testament reminded God of his Son, that he could look at the mercy seat and say, I know that Jesus is the true mercy seat, and that all of these sins will be paid for by him. Right? And so Paul gives us that in Romans chapter 3 and throughout Romans, really. Romans quotes the Old Testament more than most other books in the New Testament. He gives us this continuity with the Old Testament to say that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Jesus did not come to abolish the law, right? He came to fulfill it. And so this is the development of the Apostolic Period, is that how does the Jewish community of faith embrace Christ without losing their Jewishness? And then stemming off of that, a secondary issue is then if the Jewish community of faith embraces Christ without losing their Jewishness, how do they then include Gentiles without requiring them to be Jewish? This is the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, right? What do we compel the Gentiles to do if they want to be a part of the community of faith? This is throughout all of the epistles, right? If you want to take a stab at why was an epistle written, Jew-Gentile tension is a fair guess, and so that's a serious issue. And so that's basically the Apostolic Period. In sum, is that initially it's okay, we have the Old Testament, now what do we do with Jesus, right? So from a Jewish perspective, how do we manage these things? But then that raises the question, how do we then incorporate the Gentiles, right? And so what do we do with that? And so what we're going to start to see as we transition towards the patristic period is we're going to see this kind of flip, okay? And so when the Jews start with Old Testament, and then move to Jesus and say, okay, now we have Jesus, now what do we do with the Gentiles? The Gentiles are going to come from the exact opposite perspective. They're going to say, well, hey, we have Jesus, so why do we need the Old Testament? Right? And we see this latent within Christianity to today, right? Christians are infamous for not knowing their Old Testament, and unfortunately, the better you want to know your New Testament, the better you ought to study your Old Testament, because the New Testament writers, as I've demonstrated already, are incredibly reliant on Old Testament themes and quotations, allusions, etc. And so as we move into the patristic period, we'll see that this is the issue that we have in the Apostolic Period has now been flopped, right? We have, instead of approaching it from this side and saying through the Old Testament we get to Jesus, what do we do with the Gentiles? The Gentiles come in and say, we have Jesus, why do we need the Old Testament? And, we'll see this initially with Marcion. Marcion will come in, he's one of the first heretics, and he'll say, God of the Old Testament is not the same God as Jesus. Jesus came to save us from the God of the Old Testament, right? He's one of the first heretics, and the church has to look at him and say, no. Right? We have to say, no, we don't agree with that. And we'll see as we move forward that that's how theological discussion primarily gets developed, is through controversy, through the articulation of heresy, through the articulation of an insufficient position. The church has to respond by defeating the insufficient position, establishing the sufficient position, and convincing people of those two things, right? Convincing people that view is wrong, this view is right. Right? This is the main development of theological ideas throughout history. And so we'll see this beginning with Marcion. The church is going to have to say, no, Jesus is in continuity with the Old Testament. And they're going to rely on the Apostolic Period for that. They're going to rely on the writers of the New Testament for that, to show here's Here's how that works. But the New Testament hasn't been canonized yet, and so it's an interesting period. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's not jump into that too quickly. That's what we're going to deal with the New Testament. And one of the reasons that we're going to deal with that is the rapid growth of the church. I want to show you a couple of maps here. Let's look at the map for the first century. This is churches in the first century. So notice we've gotten to the Italian peninsula. We've gotten a little bit around Asia Minor and Greece, and we're obviously around Judea, Jerusalem, etc. But there's not that much widespread Christian community, right? And so these are primarily Jewish communities, right? The community in Rome is primarily Jewish. If you read the Paul's epistle to the Romans, a lot of the Greek communities were Jewish communities, and obviously the Judean communities are Jewish. But then when we move to the second century, look what happens. We start to make our way around the Mediterranean Sea. We've got more churches in the areas where there were just a few. But watch this. Look what happens when we get to the third century. Wow. Right? We're all the way up to England. We're all the way out to Spain. We've basically covered all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. Just look at that for a moment. I'm just going to go through these real quick just to show you the growth, okay? So first century, second century, third century. Bam. One of the hardest parts of the patristic period, particularly the early patristic period, this is what we're going to get into in the next few weeks, is figuring out a way to maintain orthodox teaching in the midst of rapid expansion. This is significantly difficult. How do you manage discipleship when there are more people converting than you have the time or resources to teach? How do you handle that? This is a serious problem for the church. It's a good problem, right? That's a problem that we would all happily accept, right? My church is growing faster than I can manage it, right? This is not a bad problem, but it's a problem nonetheless. And so we're going to deal with that over the next couple of weeks. With regard to finishing out this week, make sure that you get your forum post done. For your forum post, as I said on the forum itself, you don't need to be super detailed. I just want to get to know you, okay? I'm going to be praying for you over the course of this class, and so it helps to know who you are. If you want to post prayer requests, you can do so publicly if you would like, or you can email them to me as well. I'm going to be praying for you nonetheless, so if you want to direct that effort, I would be grateful for that. And so that would be great. Also, if you have any questions, if there's anything that I've said that's been confusing or upsetting in any way or anything like that, feel free to let me know. I'm here to help you through this course. I want to plant in you a passion for history, and hopefully a passion for the patristic era. If I can motivate some more Protestants to enjoy the patristics, then my life will not have been in vain. I'm just kidding. But I'm hoping that you'll grow to love the patristics and the medieval period, and all of history. All of the Christians that have come before us, all of those who have loved the Lord and reflected on their relationship with Him, and then left a record of that for us, that we would be able to benefit from their diligent work and their love for the same Lord. And so I'm hoping that I can motivate a passion in you for that. In closing, you want to keep in mind the research paper. As you read, you can skim some of it. There's going to be a little bit of repetition, and so where you notice repetition, you can skim a little, but don't go overboard with that. I want to make sure that you don't skim Fairbairn as best you can. But as you're reading, whatever sticks out to you that seems interesting to you, make note of that and think about what you want to do for your research paper. And so something that here's the paradigm for the research paper. Here's how you can kind of narrow down what you want to do, okay? I want you to think of a historical period that you are interested in. And then I want you to think of a topic or an author. and then narrow the topic by author, or narrow the author by topic, and then narrow it further to probably one work by the author. Okay, and so here's what that would look like. You could do modern apologetics in the life of C.S. Lewis as present in Mere Christianity. Okay, and that would be a legitimate research paper. You would read Mere Christianity. You'd look at journal articles that pertain to Mere Christianity in the life of C.S. Lewis. You'd look at critiques of it and explain those. The author of one of our textbooks, Alistair McGrath, who wrote Historical Theology, wrote a book called Mere Apologetics, and that title is sort of a nod to Mere Christianity. And, McGrath is a big fan of Lewis, has written a biography of Lewis, and so that would be a useful resource for you. And so that's what you would want to do. You could do the patristic period, the medieval period, any period of history, narrow by author, by topic, by book, and just kind of drill down. You want to be more specific rather than less specific. So you don't want to say, I want to do the doctrine of salvation. That's a book. Okay. You want to do the doctrine of salvation in the patristic period in Irenaeus's demonstration of the apostolic preaching, right? You want to narrow down because the broader it gets, the more unmanageable it'll be, and the harder it'll be for you to research. Okay, but send those topics to me. Send your ideas to me as you have them, and I will give you feedback on that. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Looking forward to getting to know you, and just hope and pray that the Lord uses this course to shape you and conform you to the image of His Son. Amen.